Thank you very much for having me here. When I was asked to speak about this, the challenge that I set to myself was that imagine that you have a Justice Sri Krishna Commission which is going to write a law on this subject. Okay? Then imagine that we have to do some homework and we have to make a presentation to him about what are the basic issues in this field and what kind of law do we need to write. So that is the challenge I set myself, to make an interesting and conceptual slideshow. So before I embark on this, I want to beg everybody's forgiveness in advance. Some of this will appear harsh to you. It's not that I have anything personal against the profession. Many of you are my friends. Many of my best friends are company secretaries and so on. I have absolutely nothing against the profession. This is how we do public policy. This is how we think about public policy. We have to be fairly tough about it. We have to be fairly no-nonsense about it. So it is not that I have anything against any of you, either individually or taken as a collective. Okay, let me get started. So when you think back at how countries get started and how professions first develop, at first you have an environment where the government systems are pretty badly done. Okay, in that environment, what is the role of many kinds of professionals? The professional is an interface between a user and a government. Okay, so government has some horrible forms, government has 45 different forms, and it is a big pain dealing with the government. So the role of the professional is to tell the CEO that don't worry, I will deal with it. I know all the compliances that are required. I will fill the right forms. I will go stand in the queue. I will know every little messy thing that is there, that on this date, this form has to be submitted, and so on. And the skill of the professional, the contribution of the professional is that he knows the system. He knows how the system works, and he's able to work the system. Okay, so this is the role of the professional under an environment of a bad government interface. And all of you will recognize what I'm saying as being a description of where we have come from. Now, that's not going to last, because the interface between the government and the citizen is already improving and is going to improve further. Okay? Computerization will happen. Greater standardization of forms will happen. The internet will give you better resources on how to fill the form. So first, the form will come into a web browser. Second, there will be a video guiding you on how to fill the form. Third, there will be some website which will do the full compliance for you. It will do an e-filing for you. Okay, these things are going to get fixed. You can't build a long-term future for a profession on that platform. Okay, increasingly, that is going away. To give you an analogy, how difficult is it today for a normal middle-class person to file his own taxes? You know, with modern e-filing, it's really not that difficult. More and more people will do it for themselves. So you needed a priesthood earlier to interface between the government and the citizen, and that the role of that priesthood will increasingly evaporate. Today, many Indian government websites are still pretty badly done, but just give it a couple of years, you see how it will change. And the websites will all open up their interfaces, and there'll be third-party software that will do submissions. Okay, so your Tally and your Quicken will basically become your interface to the government. Then what is the role for the professional? Now, the knee-jerk response many times is to fight back, to try to protect the old system. Okay, so we will have many people who will try to say, I like my old club environment, and can we go back to that old club environment? Okay, so can I create some more closed systems? Can I create some more opacity? Can I create some role for the priesthood, where the relationship between man and God only runs through a priesthood? And you can create some more opaque organizations to support that. Now, I think that that's simply not a tenable line of thought. Okay? The users will get frustrated and the users will respond. One line of thought is that the users will create entire professional outsourcing mechanisms to bypass the compliance. Here is an example. In America, the great story we heard about a Manhattan lawyer. In America, lawyers came to monopolize many functions, and to do many simple things, you had to go to a lawyer and you had to pay vast fees to lawyers. Okay? And it became a racket. There was a big rent being captured by lawyers. How did the market economy fight back? The market economy fought back by creating legal process outsourcing to India, where you will have one lawyer putting his stamp, but the work is being done by other much cheaper clerical staff who is sitting in Madras. And the entire fee in the business just gets wiped out when you do that. And there can be devastating responses from the political establishment. For example, look at what has happened to the Medical Council of India. Okay, so let us not be complacent. Let us not assume that this club system will keep on going forever. The politicians will wake up at some point and completely destroy it. If we are not the first advocates of change, we should be the ones carrying a responsible set of proposals for how this profession will work, how the laws will be redrafted, and then we have a ghost of a chance. Otherwise, we will end up like the Medical Council of India. So what's that long-term response? That long-term response is to anticipate this crisis, to preempt the crisis, is to think in a more fundamental way about what this club is all about and change it. Okay, and my claim is that we have to switch away from being a club to being a regulator. And a regulator is an organism like a state. Let us understand what the roles are, let us understand what the functions are, and the long-term survival of the institute and the long-term survival of the company secretary requires turning it from a club to a regulator. Now what does that mean? A state is more cruel on the people who break the rules. Okay, that's a fundamental difference between a club and a state. A club is kind to its own. A club will always cover up for the failures of its own. A club will make common cause with its own. A state is capable of cruelty. A state is capable of inflicting punishment. If you cannot do that, you are not state. So the first hallmark of a state-like structure is an institutional capacity for cruelty. And I want to use these harsh words because all of us have to confront that. If we do not create the ability to be tough, if we do not create the ability to inflict punishment upon our own brothers, then we are not state. We simply cannot function. This whole story will grind to a halt unless we create checks and balances surrounding an institutional capacity to be cruel. The second key function of state is rule of law. Once you say I'm state, then you cannot be idiosyncratic. Then you have to be rule of law. Rule of law means the law is known before any action takes place. Principles of natural justice are followed. I don't judge my own case. When I'm accused, I'm always given an opportunity to present my side of the case. And people in similar situations are treated similarly, and so on. This whole machinery goes with state. Once you say I'm state, you have to say rule of law. Then it stops being a club. Then it stops being about who is my friend or my cousin or who supported me when I was running for election. Then you've got to be rule of law. So the words rule of law have to come to prominence when we say that we are state and we are not a club. And the third is we have to have a clear separation of functions. All states are three pillars. There is a legislative function, there is an executive function, and there is a judicial function. All three functions have to be understood, identified, performed, and they have to be performed with separation of functions. If we try to smear these functions together, we are on the road to ruin. We will mess it up. We will not be able to do it properly. So a professional organization must become a regulator. A regulator is a mini state. A regulator has to have clarity on what is its legislative function, what is its executive function, and what is its judicial function. And it must perform these three under an environment of rule of law. Now, what is the legislative function in an SRO like this one? The legislative function is establishing codes of conduct and entry conditions. Okay, so a body of law must be drafted and it must constantly evolve, which writes down what is this code of conduct. What is the executive function? The holding of exams, which is the entry barrier, is an executive function. And a new thing that is needed, which we don't do too much of in India, is we need a whole investigation function. We need an institutionalized capacity for enforcing law. That is the executive function. Then there is a judicial function, which is where we have to discipline members. So when the investigating function finds that there is something that has gone wrong, then a hearing has to take place, where a dispassionate party of judicial temperament hears an accusation by an investigator, hears the defense by the accused, and writes an order, and that order appears on a website. Okay, so that operation of a sound SRO has to turn into these three functions: a formal institutional capacity for writing laws, for an executive function of investigations, and a quasi-judicial function of disciplining members. Now, where we are in India is far away from this. In the legislative function, we are a little good, we are a little bad. I'll talk about that in a moment. In the executive function, we are only doing an examination, and we're really doing nothing by way of investigation. And if anything, we have to turn this upside down. Okay, I mean, all of us know there is nothing great happening in the examination. This profession can be much more open than meets the eye. And we are doing nothing in terms of investigation. We need to create a whole investigative capacity. In the judicial function, quite frankly, as a member of the public, I think that there is a zero implementation rate of punishments against members. It may even be taking place in secret, but it's not happening in public. Now that doesn't work, because the public needs to see that there is enforcement. The public will not trust an SRO if the public does not see punishments. Okay, so the whole operation of the SRO has to happen in public domain. The public must see investigations. The public must see orders. The public must see punishment. The public must see consequences. Otherwise, you will not be respected, you will not be trusted, and you are potentially on a highway to the Medical Council of India. Okay, so let me briefly describe how each of these functions can be made to work properly. Let's start with the legislative function. So what we need is detailed codes of conduct which are written in the spirit of law. Okay, not pious phrases, but written in the spirit of laws, which are completely available on a website. So everything should be open, it should be available to the public. Further, they should be explained, so there should be notes to laws, there should be FAQs, there should be how-tos, and the public, the user, should be clear on what is the mechanism for grievance redressal. That if as a member of the public I have a problem with what I believe a certain company secretary has done, there should be a formal mechanism for complaint. All this should be a part of the operation of the legislative function. In the executive function, we need far more introspection, again in public domain, on the way this examination stuff is working. For example, do we review the tests? Do we introspect question by question? Which question was successfully discriminating between the good and bad students? Which question was failing to do discrimination? Are we getting a bell curve on the performance on the test? If you give the test to some of the best company secretaries in India, what kind of scores do they get? And so on. Can we implement all this, and can we implement it in public domain? Again and again, I will emphasize to you, if we are to step away from being a club to being something like a state, we have to operate under conditions of complete transparency. All these things have to happen in public domain. The second is we have to go after a whole continuing education process, and that has to be examinations and not seminars. Okay, if you take a knowledge purpose seriously, then it's got to be tested in exams. Chitra runs examinations for dealers in NSE, and the exam has an expiry of 3 years. No matter how many $1 million you make trading on NSE, every 3 years you have to go back and take the exam based on whatever is the current curriculum. The instruments change, the regulations change, you have to take the exam again. So just because you pass the exam once, it doesn't mean you keep going for life. Then the third is the investigation function. An input into investigations can be complaints. The profession needs to speak in public domain. How many complaints are being received? What is the speed with which they are being processed? How many complaints are being taken seriously? How many investigations are beginning? Are investigations time-bound? Are complainants given real-time data about the rate of progress of their complaints? Okay, this is the kind of seriousness with which we should be performing the executive function in order to be taken seriously as a quasi-state apparatus. And then I come to the judicial function. The first thing that I would ask for is that the judiciary, the quasi-judicial function, should be performed by disinterested parties. It cannot be performed by club members. Okay, so here is an example. The UK law on legal practitioners requires that the chairman of a proceedings, when an enforcement action is done against a lawyer, has to be a non-lawyer. Okay, think about it, that it is innately difficult for a club member to enforce against a club member. So once you get a hearing where the investigation department is saying something against a professional and the accused is defending himself, now the judge cannot be a fellow club member. The judge has to be a disinterested party. He has to be somebody external to the profession. Then we need to create a whole set of procedural law governing this adjudication process, where all details are written down. We should give a mechanism through which the complainant is given a window into participation in this process. We should create a time-bound, efficient judicial function. So, in short, my suggestions for what we should think going forward is that we should ask Justice Sri Krishna to lead a commission which will draft a law. Okay? And that law should write down these three aspects of the objectives of the legislative function, the accountability mechanisms through which the institute will be held accountable for the performance of the legislative function, then a clear definition of the executive function, and a set of accountability mechanisms through which we will hold the institute accountable for performing on those mechanisms, and a judicial function. And once again, a whole bunch of accountability mechanisms through which we measure how this is working. I want to exhort everybody in this room that we talk about corporate governance of the corporations of India. Then the company secretary, who is the gatekeeper, the company secretary is the high priest of corporate governance, must live by a higher standard. The organization of the company secretaries should be the best governed body of all. It must have the highest standards of governance. It should be the role model for everybody else. That is the way we will achieve respect. Now, you will say all the things I'm saying are very anti-company secretaries. Okay? That is one way of putting it. But I want to say that is the only fair arrangement. When society gives you the privilege of performing certain functions, when society gives you a guaranteed cash flow, then in return there have to be certain obligations. And if we do a good job of establishing a whole regulatory framework surrounding this obligation, we will create incentives in favor of better behavior. We will reward the good professionals, and we will create checks and balances against misbehavior. And that is the best thing we can all ask for. We have to be cruel to be kind. If we start out by saying, I'll be a nice guy, I'll be a nice guy, I'll be a nice guy, then it's a race to the bottom and we will really fail. On transparency, I've already discussed repeatedly that the legislative and the executive and the judicial functions should all be done very transparently. Here is an example. My team and I, we landed up on the website and we tried to look at the Institute of Company Secretaries of India, and we found nothing on the enforcement actions taken by the institute. So we decided to look at New York, which is famous for having badass lawyers. And we found that there is a bar website of the city of New York where you can type in the name of any lawyer and you get his full lifetime of enforcement actions. Okay? In the city of New York itself, in calendar year 2013 itself, there were 65 disciplinary actions against lawyers. 10 guys got so scared because they knew that this was going to happen that they resigned. Okay, note, this is a man who has spent pots of money, built up a career as a lawyer, who has resigned from the bar and will never practice law again. So it is a pretty draconian punishment for the guy. 12 guys were actually disbarred. This is only 2013. This is only one city, New York. It's only Manhattan Island. I'm not even counting anybody far away. All this information is made visible to the consumer. That is how we win trust. Until we do that, we will be mistrusted as a club that is interested in rent seeking. And we will one day invite the wrath of politicians who will do a medical council of India on us. My last comment is on professional development. Professional development is the thinking of a club. I would encourage all of us to get away from that. Markets will do that. Competition will do that. Okay? People will try to build a business. They will do that. The job of the SRO is not to cater to the welfare of members. The job of the SRO is to perform a regulatory function. Thank you.